So, friends, colleagues, I'm Professor Deborah Johnson and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at London South Bank University. So this evening I have the lovely task of welcoming you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Igea Troiani. I'm going to introduce the lecture, and before I do that I say what I always say to a large group of people: I do stammer, I will get stuck on words, and it will all be fine. Now, before I formally introduce Professor Troiani, a little about the nature of an inaugural lecture for any of you who's here for the first time. So an inaugural lecture is a new professor's first opportunity to formally demonstrate their contribution to their academic discipline. And it's a moment to talk about the journey that someone has taken. It's also a moment of celebration for the schools that the professor is based in, and in this case the School of Built Environment and Architecture. A moment of celebration, colleagues. And it's a moment for the university to celebrate and to showcase our contribution through the achievements and esteem of our professorial faculty. So it's a significant milestone in the career of every professor. And we're here this evening then to hear more about the contribution of Professor Troiani, her work, its impact, and the journey she's taken to reach this point in her career. So it's appropriate we meet in this way, and that also means I have to give you that standard welcome to an in-person event. Please make sure your mobile phones are switched off. The toilets are just outside, they are signposted. Keep in mind we are recording, and we're not planning a fire alarm test. So if the alarm does go off, please make your way in an orderly fashion, I think I have to say, either to the front or the back of this room, and follow the fire exit signs. So, Igea will be well known to many of you here, but it's appropriate that I give her a full and formal introduction, even at the risk of embarrassing her. So let me share a little bit about Professor Troiani. Igea is a Professor of Architecture and Head of Division for Architecture at LSVU. Her three key areas of research are the social production of architecture, architecture and media, and architectural labour, neoliberalism and sustainable ecologies. So she has over 25 years of working in a university setting and as an architect. And that journey spans a number of countries and continents, so from the UK to China, Germany and Australia. Professor Troiani's academic career began with a Bachelor of Applied Science at Queensland University of Technology, and that was awarded in 1989. After that, she went on to a Bachelor of Architecture with Honours at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and that was awarded in 1993. In 1996, she became a registered architect in Australia, and after that began her Doctor of Philosophy at QUT, and her thesis title was The Politics of Friends in Modern Architecture. It's fascinating, isn't it? And she was awarded that in 2005. In 2008, she co-founded Original Field of Architecture, OFA, in Oxford with her husband, Andrew Dawson. She studies architecture from transdisciplinary perspectives, and that will talk to many of us in this room. And she's focusing on the conditions in which architecture is, and architects are, socially, culturally, and economically produced. She's won a number of research grants and research awards, and has produced a series of publications. Her books include The Politics of Making, Transdisciplinary Urbanism and Culture, architecture filmmaking, spaces of tolerance, and due out soon, and with the same title as this evening's lecture, work-life balance in architecture. She teaches in architectural history and theory, in architectural design and in research methods, and she's supervised dissertations in all of these areas. She says she supervised hundreds of dissertations at undergraduate and postgraduate level, and she's been successful in some of those students winning awards, so I was able to pick out 3 here. So in 2017, her student Sophia Barnard won an award for design research on inclusive living. And in 2010, her student George Wilson won an award for a project entitled Mourning the People's Princess, Public Grief and the Consecration of Space. It's fascinating, isn't it? And then also in 2010, Matt Townsend won an award with a project on solar-powered water filtration. She's examined PhDs in Ireland, Australia, Portugal and the UK, and she's been an external examiner at the University of Westminster, the University of Sheffield and Birmingham School of Architecture. She was invited juror for the Council of Editors of Learned Journals and the Royal Institute of British Architects Dissertation Prize. As well as this, she has a wide and strong track record of service to the discipline. She is chair of Women in Architecture UK, was a member of the Executive Committee and secretary of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, and chair of the Architectural Humanities Research Association, that's AHRA. She remains an AHRA steering group member. In AHRA, she initiated and founded the interdisciplinary award-winning journal Architecture and Culture, for which she's been editor-in-chief since 2013. She has given invited keynote addresses and lectures in Leeds, Manchester, Bristol, Copenhagen, Karlsruhe, Melbourne, and has been interviewed on the radio. An impressive record of extensive contribution, I'm sure we'll all agree. Igea has 2 children, Lola and Valentino, and she enjoys long walks in the English countryside with her dog Olive. Actually, fabulous photo of the dog on the OFA site, very cute dog. Guests and colleagues, please welcome Professor Igea Troiani, sorry, it's stuck on the T sound, with her inaugural lecture entitled Work-Life Balance in Architecture.
Thank you very much. I hope that's not too loud. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Great opportunity to deliver an inaugural lecture. So I just wanted to say what this photograph is of, because whenever I produce books, I'm really very particular about what the images are. So a lot of the images that will be included in the book are significant. This is a photograph of Moshe Safdie, who designed a really sort of, I think, innovative housing proposal in 1967. It was called Habitat 67, and it's him and his daughter. She became an architect. And I wrote to her saying I was producing the book and asked if I could have some family photos, and she sent me this one, which I thought was quite lovely. So, the title of the lecture, or the subtitle I think is important, Gender 24/7 like Capitalism and the End of Sleep. I'm going to kind of be quite formal in this lecture, because whenever I give lectures with students, I walk around meander. I thought this might be a little bit more serious. So Okay, as the construction industry and architecture within it becomes increasingly economically driven and centred essentially on performance delivery in a global marketplace, architects are under increasing pressure to perform by working longer hours. Simultaneously, as the profession is becoming more feminised, and by that I mean more females becoming architects, previous rigid divisions of labour enacted between the home and the places of work are slowly being blurred. Now, regardless of the extensive work that's been done to achieve gender parity in architecture, in March 2023, so just the latest statistics, only 31% of ARB, so that's the Architects Registration Board, registered architects identified as female. Many male architects too are starting to want a less pressured life. And I think with more time at home and less in the office. I think I've been teaching for a long time, and I think younger generations of architects, they're seeking a better life that's more ecologically, socially and ethically balanced. But I think we're up against a culture of the creative architect's work life which occupies every hour of their day. And for that, it remains a kind of consistent barrier in the way the profession can progress. So this lecture is part of a book that I think I'll finish it at the end of April. It's taken me quite a long time. It's probably been the biggest thing I've written. It's definitely got my heart in it. It's as long as my PhD, let's put it that way. So it's 120,000 words. It discusses the subject of work-life balance in relation to gender, but the capitalism is an important part and the sleep's an important part because it's about, so I'll just unplug that, I'm not sure why it cuts out. I think it's when I don't move it. But it's really about a constructed body of work that's been built up over some time. So I'm Australian from my accent. You can tell I've lived here for 20 years, almost 20 years. But when I first gave, the first paper I ever gave in architecture publicly at a conference, somebody who taught me in my first year came up to me and said, did you remember that your first ever essay was called Women in Architecture? And I actually hadn't remembered it. So I've concluded that I have been working on this topic since 1984, which makes me very old, actually. But these three publications here are the things that I think really, I started to hanker into it, you know, and they come out 2014, 2016, 2018. They're ones where I'm trying to sort of identify what a woman architect is. I never really understood what it was. I was taught by one woman architect when I was in my undergraduate, 3 in my postgraduate. But actually, what is the definition of that practitioner? And it mutated into the way in which architectural education can be gendered. And then I started to really hanker in on some work on Zaha Hadid. Obviously because she's the most famous architect, arguably, in the world. At the same time, I was working in universities, and we have an office, and over my lifetime, I think questions of performativity and delivery and expectations have increased. And because I didn't have any time, I wrote this paper on the plane to the conference. And weirdly, it's probably been the most significant thing I've ever written, which probably means that I can produce things pretty well under pressure. But it was called Academic Capitalism in Architecture Schools. And it was a big thing for me to try and understand the modes of production and the way in which it affects the products of education and the producers of education. And so this whole collective of work has been expanded in new trajectories in the book. So I'm only going to talk about a little piece of the book now, but it covers sort of 3 areas. It contextualizes the life of an architect under neoliberalism. And the reason why I focus on neoliberalism is because I think it's a really primary reason for understanding the pressures that have come upon us in the workplace. But I also look at two things. There's a theory of homo economicus, which is called economic man, which is that, and that can be gender neutral, economic man, but against the notion of femina domestica, which is the domestic woman. But the domestic woman can also be gender neutral, male as well. That first part of the book actually covers many different things which look at differences not only in gender but also class, race, ethnicity and different generations, because I think all of those things become contributing factors. And the selection of images, so these are actually from the book. So I like to cross my studies in film that I do with the other things, so everything kind of has parallels. The second part of the book is called Gameplay Moves, Become an Architect or Not. And this one is a section which is about, I really start because actually Frank Lloyd Wright's mother was known for standing over his cot and saying to him, "You're going to become an architect, you're going to become an architect." And she put paintings of cathedrals around his cot. And I think when I first read that as a historian, I thought, well, you know, that moment when somebody decides you're going to become an architect can be very, very interesting. When does it start? How does it build up? How do you make those choices? And under neoliberalism, where the key feature of this is choice, the choice to make a decision to do something, I decided to look at the journey, like literally a biographical journey of the choices you can make. Where to study, how you study, what education is like, entrepreneurialism within the university, and then I move on to practice. And then the end of that section is about when people decide not to be an architect. And actually that's an ever-increasing thing. You know, people might study for 6 years and move sideways into other design disciplines. And I think for me, this sort of biographical journey, and the photographs here are quite significant. I mean, they're all particular ones, but 7 Up is quite an interesting documentary series for me. I grew up with it in Australia. It was as significant in Australia as it was here. And, you know, questions of class and opportunity and which school you went to and how that constructed cumulative advantage or disadvantage has always been something that quite interested me. So that top photograph comes from one of the documentaries of the 2 boys. And then the bottom one is Alison Smithson. So she's got the headscarf on. She's an English architect attributed to the brutalist movement. And she's sitting at a table with her 2 then children. She has 3. And the little boy is Simon Smithson, so he became an architect. And they're sitting at the table with Raina Banham, who's a really significant historian. And you know, that sort of path where in that moment that future for Simon Smithson is set up, I think, while it's bubbling away at home, becomes this. I use a lot of examples in these, and that's one of them, about an easier path that some might have available to them. The last part of the book is about time, technology and workplaces split. And actually I should probably change the order of those. But it looks at the sites in which we work and the fact that an architect can work anywhere, an educator can work anywhere. You know, I would sit at the side of a football field while my son was playing football and I'd be working. And that kind of, you know, the way in which you can access work continuously, no matter what your narrative is in your life, that became very significant for me to understand in the book. So I talk about it between work, home and everywhere. And then the next part is about 24/7 capitalism, no sleep and no time. And that's because of practices actually now in architecture very much running continuously. So you might have a practice in London, which can also have an office in Singapore, that can have an office somewhere else. And I have had students who'll be working on a project where it will never stop. So that kind of idea to me I think is very interesting about what that might mean about the future of a profession which essentially has no clock on it anymore. And the last part of the book I think looks at what this life might be that could be more balanced. And I come up with a few different strategies, none of which are I think definitive, I think they might be pathways. Some are economical, some are to do with the body, and others are to do with collectivism and empathy. Anyway, and those photographs are of the Beaux-Arts. So the Beaux-Arts, that's how an architect used to be trained, where one would sit and draw endlessly for hours in a gallery that was amazing. And then on the right, and actually the Beaux-Arts education is the education that we now follow, so it starts in Paris, but it actually constructs the whole of architectural education within England, Australia, and so forth. And then on the right is Foster in his office now. And you know, that kind of positioning of something that has moved in a couple of 100 years, I think is quite interesting for me. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is something that I wrote that I think encapsulates the whole of the book, like in a sort of confined version, if you'd like to think of it like that. So this is a photograph of Zaha Hadid with Margaret Thatcher, and actually I'd always thought it was taken at the Architectural Association in London, but in fact I think just lately somebody's alluded to the fact it might be the Royal Academy of Art. And she's showing her a model of the Peak project, which was a big competition that she designed in Hong Kong. But it's just a lovely photograph for me to use as a positioning for this talk. Okay, so I'm going to get started. So essentially it's going to focus on the work of the British-Iraqi architect, Dame Zaha Hadid, born in 1950, passed away in 2016. And I use her life essentially as a critical aperture to show the challenges that we face in improving work-life balance in the profession at the level of architecture's culture. So by that I mean the culture in which we nurture architects. As an architect, I think I discuss in the lecture, I'm interested in the spatial implications that come from where she works and how she works. And I analyse Hadid's penthouse in Clerkenwell, where she lived briefly for 2.5 years, which was adjacent to her office. So she decided to live right next to it. And I present the story of her penthouse in the context of Baroness Margaret Thatcher and Thatcher's neoliberal capitalism. And I build upon the writings of Michel, Foucault and Wendy Brown, who give critiques of neoliberalism. But what I'm actually looking at is Hadid's life in relation to architectural production, her as a product. I'm looking at the corporate level of architecture, its purest ideological form. She becomes the exemplary, the architect, and the ties to her body and to the concept of economic man that I spoke about briefly as homo economicus. The lecture here tonight aims to explore the relationship between neoliberalism, supreme creativity, because that's how I describe what she did, and the sacrifices made by elite architects that can impact on them corporally. It argues for a better work-life balance in the profession, a change in attitude to work hours, and to the valuing of rest and sleep. Okay. So because I'm obsessed with people's biographies, I just am. Everybody I've ever studied in architecture, I need to know where they went to school, who taught them, where they lived. It helps me understand who they are. So Zaha Hadid, this is 1972. She started her studies at the Architectural Association. So this is her as a student with one of the installations that she produced when she was at the school. And this is her as a little girl with her parents. So she's the daughter of the artist. Her mother was an artist and her father was a wealthy industrialist. He was also a co-founder of the left liberal group and the National Democratic Party in Iraq. So she came from a socialist-oriented, influential, I would say, upper-class family. She studied at an Iraqi convent school for Muslims, Jews and Christians in the 1960s. And this is a quote from an interview with Simon Hatterston that she had, when women were empowered and anything seemed possible. She later attended English and Swiss boarding schools before she moved to London. Now, after she graduated, and also I thought this was a photograph taken of, so this is the early OMA, if anybody knows the characters, but somebody recently told me that they don't have a photograph of any of them together, and this is a collage. So that's quite an interesting sort of layer of things. But basically, after she graduated, she worked for her former tutors. So they were the OMA original founders. Rem Koolhaas is the taller figure, for anyone who's not an architect. Elian Zengelis, that was his tutor. And she then, after working for them, decided to open up her own firm in 1980 called Zaha Hadid Architects, or ZHA. She also became a naturalised British citizen. Now, 1 year earlier, in May 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. She was one of two daughters of Beatrice Ethel Stevenson and the English grocer, the Methodist preacher and politician Alfred Roberts. Thatcher grew up in provincial Grantham, and in her memories, The Path to Power, she admits that her upbringing and all of her early experiences of working in a corner store allowed her to gain, quote, a sympathetic insight into capitalism or the free enterprise system. Thatcher claims she saw, quote, that it was satisfying customers that allowed her father to increase the number of people he employed. She knew that it was international trade which brought tea, coffee, sugar and spices to those who frequented the shop. And more than that, she experienced that business, as can be seen in any marketplace anywhere, was a lively, human, social and sociable reality. In fact, though serious, she saw that it was fun. She explains, there is no better course for understanding free market economics than life in a corner shop. Now, according to Thatcher, her father was inspired by this book, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which was she describes him as an old-fashioned liberal who believes strongly in individual responsibility and financial soundness. Having lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s and coming from a frugal but reasonably middle-class family, Thatcher worked her way up the socio-economic ladder, studying chemistry on a scholarship at the University of Oxford from 1943 to 47, and then she became a barrister and then a politician. So she herself got a scholarship. As Prime Minister, Thatcher and the movement that she spawned encouraged women and men in Britain to work hard for their own personal gain in order to move them from being dependents on the state welfare system to becoming self-sufficient and prosperous within free market economy. She reduced government spending for those seeking welfare support, incentivised those living in council housing, which had been heavily discounted, to then buy their own homes. She saw that by doing this, she would make people independent, self-supporting, and her right to buy policy allowed the government the opportunity to deliver that. And this is her with, I mean, there are some great photo shoots, but this one is actually my favourite photo of, you know, people buying their houses in the first batch of the right to buy policies. She had a very close relationship with Ronald Reagan. So along with President Reagan, who was elected in 1980, in her memoirs she talks about how funny he was. That's her main admiration for him, was how humorous he was. Thatcher embarked on a campaign to encourage the privatisation of property, the deregulation of industry to facilitate global free trade and free markets. These economic strategies of business cost-cutting were seen to promote global competition to restore economic power and superiority to Britain. It was in the context of Thatcher's newly competitive Britain, a period coinciding with the rise of feminism, that Hadid initially opened her own firm, ZHA. While she struggled to build her architectural practice initially, it was through her persistence, tenacity, and people say fighting spirit that she finally established the empire and body of work which she has since been recognised for. So this is an exhibition of her work in 1983. And these are quite interesting, these exhibitions, because she designs everything. She designs the pattern on the floor, the paintings on the wall, everything. So the reading that I give here of Hadid's professional success is through the lens of neoliberalism and of herself as a product and of a producer of high-end architecture. I refer to neoliberalism here as a class-based political project aimed at new capital accumulation, and that's as defined by David Harvey in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Now, my interest in reading Hadid through this gender-neutral actor of the homo economicus, or economic man, and it's through that, but also as her part of a creative class. This is her penthouse in Clerkenwell, where she lived for 2.5 years from 2006. And I use it to discuss the dominance of professional corporate life in the private sphere of her life. From 1978 to 79, the eve of the elections of both Thatcher and Reagan, Michel Foucault examined neoliberalism through a series of lectures that were published in this book, and in relation to governmentality, or the art of government, he describes it as. And it's the way in which the government exerts power on the body politic. So what he means by that is that different government policies have an effect on the way in which they physically affect you as the body politic. Okay. In the book of the collated lectures, he notes the changing associations between biology and politics, biopolitics, and the powerful role that economic man plays in it. According to Foucault, homo economicus is competitive, driven, and singularly focused on their work life. More importantly, they have to be entrepreneurial. That's a very fundamental aspect, using creativity to gain a market edge in a global economy. Now, in her reflections on Foucault's lectures, the political scientist Wendy argues in this book that under neoliberalism's free market advocacy, economic man takes its shape as human capital always seeking to strengthen its competitive positioning to appreciate value. So what that means is that it's always about growth. It's always about increasing value, increasing money production, or whatever capital production is involved. And what this means is that everything is for sale. So she talks about economic rationalism demanding that education, healthcare, falling pregnant, the city, architecture, design labour, and the designer are not only commoditized, but also co-opted to maximize return of investment through innovation. Now this is Margaret Thatcher with her twins. So regardless of the gender identity of economic man, they are highly employable and productive in their labour, generally because they're seen to be family free. Now that's a phrase that's used by Ali Russell Hochschild and Anne Mushang in the book The Second Shift, where they talk about working parents and the revolution of home. Now, being family free does not mean that you don't have a family. Actually, that's a sort of misunderstanding people have. Economic man can be married or partnered or whatever. and they can have children. The key thing is that they don't look after them. The care responsibilities are transferred onto somebody else who will be using that time in their day to have the care responsibilities to give the person to be working on their career progression. Now, in Thatcher's case, her twins were cared for by nannies almost from the time that they were born, enabling her to progress her career. Now, the difference between choosing between femina domestica, and actually in the book, is it a choice? You know, these are the questions that I go to, rather than economic man here, the political kind of vision of the leader, occurs because of the decision to choose or not to devote time to partners, children, anything else, or only your work, okay? Now, it's well known that Hadid chose not to marry and not to have children. She would repeatedly in interviews say if she wanted to, she would have partnered somebody, she would have had children. She chose not to. And instead, she would often talk about her staff as her family. When queried at the age of 58 about her private life sacrifices, that was a question, and she claimed she hadn't made any sacrifices. She maintained it was through her free will that she devoted her life wholeheartedly to architecture. And by being family free, this had allowed her to become a supreme version of the economic woman. Now, this is from a famous film called The Fountainhead. He's a heroic architect based on a real architect called Louis Sullivan, who's recognised as a key figure in the design of Chicago, okay? But this guy, this figure, Howard Rourke, he's often used in architecture as, you know, he's creative, he fights, he will not give up on his design. He would rather destroy a building than have something produced that wasn't what he wanted to design. So this idea of the persona of the architect across a space of female, male, non-binary, whatever it might be, is quite interesting to me because the construction of it historically has always only really been male. So this persona of the architect as a creative profession is itself complex. It's conditioned by the historic constructions of both the artist and the professional. As Nancy Lewison has written, quote, "Central to the mystique of the architect in life and in movies is the idea of the architect as a person of marked creativity. Creativity so strong it can seem a primal or religious force, allowing the architect to envision what does not yet exist, and so fundamental to their identity that others cannot help but acknowledge it with various degrees of admiration, awe, envy, and fear." Now, it's because of the ability of, quote, creativity to make new worlds out of nothing and to measure that productivity as a kind of surplus value relative to other outputs, that economists such as Richard Florida have defined the value of the creative class in modern economics, in which avant-garde architectural designers, or star-architects they're called in architecture, such as Hadid, sit comfortably. According to Peggy Deemer, nowadays the architectural creative class commodifies design labour through innovative product and marketing. So design as immaterial labour gets categorised, spatialised and monetised. Market forces allow the creative class to operate as gender-neutral entrepreneurs to increase their market share because the USP of their product creates global demand, increasing revenue. Now, the image of the architect, this book was published in 1983, so this is a year before I start to write about gender and architecture. And it's quite interesting because the book is about all the images of the different kinds of architects you can be. And at this time, there isn't a single woman in the book because there isn't anybody significant enough to put in there historically. But so we start with this. We start with, sorry, is that cut out or is that okay? Can you hear me? No. I can probably just shout, can I? Can people just hear me? Yeah, it's fine. I'm good to shout. So this is starting with the creative genius. This is the artisan-driven practitioner, Frank Lloyd Wright. He's recognized as, you know, the key artist in architecture because he so frequently reinvents himself. He is also an incredible entrepreneur. When he loses out in life, he starts to sell shares in himself. That's how he creates his third phase of practice. But the thing about Frank Lloyd Wright is he is so artistically driven at each and every phase. He worked in the office of Louis Sullivan, who was in collaboration with Adler. And as I said, they created Chicago. But here we get a different model of the architect. One is the artist, and then you have the business partner. So Sullivan is the quintessential frustrated artist, and Adler is the businessman. And the businessman ends up creating the Institute of Architects, leading it in the US. So it becomes a kind of formal regulating body with his leadership. And I'm just going through the characters that are in the kind of categories for Saint. And the next one is this entrepreneur. So John Paulson becomes somebody who is exhibiting the entrepreneurial skills, but himself ends up being caught as a fraudster and caught out for that. But this feature of entrepreneurialism becomes very significant. And then you get the kind of whole package, which is the developer architect, which is categorized by John Portman, who designs, you know, sort of the Hotel Bonaventura in LA, which becomes this recognizable symbol of capital in architecture in the late 1980s. Now, this creative designer, and I'm using Frank Gehry here, who you probably all know about. So their main job now in an office is that they design, it's in their body, they've got these skills that people think are just extraordinary. But they're also, their other skill is schmoozing clients, you know, that sort of on the ground being there in order to be able to touch the clients and have that personal connection. But these good commercial practices nowadays have started to merge all of these things into one. I think compressing the timelines of productivity through the division of labour, through various people that work in these offices. You know, they can have 400, 500, up to 1,000 people in them, where one person will be doing the model making and all of that process is divvied up accordingly. But through the managerial and artistic approaches in architecture, they're often seen to be opposed. In fact, nowadays, the biggest and most profitable practices are happily coexisting these things together, because that's how they're able to do all these projects throughout the world. Now, between 1980 and 2013, Hadid went from being the architect who never got anything built, which is a quote by a famous architectural critic, to somebody who couldn't stop building. It literally just turned like that for her. And the period happens around the time that she employs Patrick Schumacher. He actually studied his BA here. He was a CAD operator for her in the office. So they're shifting from hand drawing to digital drawing. So we need to take this as a pinch point as well in the way that the productivity can change through technology. Before this, Hadid was recognized for her hand paintings, which you may have already seen advertised in various places. There have been exhibitions in London. And the shift, you know, massive paintings, huge paintings, probably, you know, up to where that white line is there. From when she was a student, she would work like that. She would make these massive models. This is the one that she, one of the ones in the exhibition with Thatcher. And she also would make her own clothes. She designed everything pretty well from as soon as she could design anything. Now, what Frank Gehry described as being so significant about her was that she made an absolutely unique brand. It wasn't that she was an incredible architect, it was that it was just this unique brand that nobody had ever seen before. And I'm just going to jump onto this. This is the Cardiff Bay project which she learns from. So she wins the project for this particular competition. And before that, she's kind of gruff with people. If they don't want her designs, she doesn't want them. But she decides from not getting this project built, she needs to change her persona. She needs to be friendly. She needs to devote her life to sort of, you know, being much more I think, amiable with her clients. And it also changes in terms of the digital fabrication of things. The brand that she produces gets described consistently as employing something called futurist smoothness. That's the brand style. And she starts to implement it not just in architecture, but in product design, in fashion, and in jewelry design. Okay, so this is still the Zaha Hadid design website. So I downloaded this last night. She sells merchandise that she designed, candle holders, chandeliers, etc. Each of them are limited and numbered editions directed at a collector market. And the maximum price for any one item used to be £10,000, but I didn't check it last night, double check that. She also, in her life, designed sets for the Pet Shop Boys. She collaborated with Karl Lagerfeld to design fashion installations for Chanel. She also designed the furniture for this, which ended up being manufactured by the Italian company Sawaya and Morani. It ends up being a kind of sub-product that comes out of it. Then she designed Louis Vuitton handbags. She collaborated with Brazilian shoe designers. These are a Melissa shoe series that she produced. Then she works with Pharrell Williams to come up with these. So these are a Zaha Hadid product that he then markets under his name. Then we get a car design, 2005 to 2008. She designs this car, which is a two-person hydrogen-powered city car with zero emissions. So she kind of didn't have time to keep designing her own clothes. So she started to get someone to design clothes around her body, and it was this woman, Elke Walter, that she employed. So each piece that she wore was a unique piece of clothing, which some commentators would say, while they were mostly black, they were kind of also reiterating the brand of the buildings. Now, what I think is quite interesting is Hadid said as she got older, she would wear more and more unconventional clothing because she felt like she was more and more of an unconventional architect, and it would allow her to be more unconventional in her behaviour. So in the very nature of star architects, that they grow from a mythological narrative, she felt obliged but also rewarded and reinforced all the myths over and over again. In the spirit of what I describe as true neoliberal marketing genius, her bodily image and the image of her private penthouse became these ideal subjects for publicity and advertising the ZHA brand. This project is the one that is described as the architecture of neoliberalism. It's one that she and Patrick Schumacher do. But this is the penthouse that I want to focus on. It is described as having had an uncompromising vision of whiteness. So Hattenston, who writes in The Guardian, described the space as the whitest whiteness everywhere. White floors, walls, white ceilings, white fiberglass sculptures that double up as white sofas. Even the astroturf on the roof terrace was white. So if you're looking at actually every single thing's her, the bag, the chairs, the paintings. While she couldn't do the paintings anymore, she started to, in the office, generate digital paintings so that they could be produced for different projects, also working with the new technologies. This is the living room, which she described as a studio space. Again, all of the furniture. The painting at the back is a painting she did when she was a student, which is inspired by the Russian constructivist architect Malevich that she was very inspired by. But, you know, many of the other things in the space are digitally produced. Now, one of the commentators who interviewed her in this space said what was so amazing was that it was utterly undomesticated. There were no books, there were no CDs, there was almost no sign of human occupation. Another small room in the penthouse was devoted to showing her collection, so she collected glass vases in sort of designer tracks. And this was her bedroom, which was on another floor, starkingly white, white blinds, adjoining bathroom, hard surfaced, and a large double bed with the cushions and covers for one of the projects she designed for a hotel in South America between 2003 2005, with a flat screen TV but a small black and red work desk that she also designed. And the dressing table, which was perfume bottles that had a stone described as being skyline-like of a city. Okay, so while Hadid designed many kitchens for her clients, the Clerkenwell apartment actually was kitchenless. And the reason it was kitchenless, well, twofold. One, she said that she thought kitchens were ugly, but also she was never there. So she actually had no need to ever cook anything for herself, because every meal she had, she claimed she needed to have it with a client or with somebody for a project. So there was a point in her life where she just tipped into almost eating out for every single meal. So at her workplace, Holub, who's a commentator, wrote that Hadid never had her own office either. She would sit right in the middle of the studio. So this is the office next door, which was walking distance from the penthouse. So her home was both inside and outside the space of the office, acting as a place for working, publicity, exhibition, sleeping, when she wasn't travelling overseas. When she started to become what is described as an architectural globetrotter, she handed much of her office running of the business to Schumacher. Now, architects have always worked in other countries, so this idea of not only working in the country that you're in, where your office is, but everyone else, I mean, it's deeply embedded in it. So if we take Lutyens in India, it's a perfect example of that. Now, what's different, though, nowadays is that architectural globetrotting is everywhere. It's not confined. Usually the empire would have an architect in one country. Now architects work across a vast number of countries. And we recently in the studio had somebody come in and talk about running projects in 26 countries. So it's not uncommon. The problem of the city was integral to the education that Hadid had, and the way in which the evolution of architecture sort of evolved, I think merges in her AA, which is an elite private school of architecture, in the development of her thinking. Now, Hadid actually went to the AA because Thatcher abolished student grants, which meant that many English students could no longer go there. But the school opened up to internationalisation with an involuntary invasion by foreign students. Now, in this, we can see these are her peers. So it's Zaha Hadid. That's Daniel Lead was skimmed. So famous American architect, and this one over here is Bernard Tschumi. So actually within her year you can almost plot the most significant architects around maybe 6 or 7 countries. In the construction of the city, you know, and in the formulation of the development of architecture in a very dense way across different countries. I'm actually going to skip that one. I'm going to talk a little bit about her tutor, Rem Koolhaas, because this idea of the exuberance of building everywhere and in continuum is one that he talks about very enthusiastically. He thinks that it is terrific for an architect to be able to build something, and I'm just going to find the exact quote. It seems clear that somehow we architects should be able, when given the impossibly difficult problem of designing in 2 weeks a city for 3 million people, to respond with vigour and skill. And this kind of idea of consistently working in other countries in order to increase economic growth is the spiralling that Hadid gets involved in. And there are questions, I think, in architecture about the ethics of working in other countries as an architect and how you adapt to culture there. But what's important for me here is something that Koolhaas translates into the thinking of an architect. And he claims you can never say no to any job because there's always going to be someone behind you who will say yes. And the phrase in architecture has become the kind of yes man. And Bjarke Ingels, who's the director of BIG, he often uses it. He talks about being yes man as being something very good. As I said, there are questions about architects working in the global marketplace because of obviously the ethics of the production of these buildings. So the critique of neoliberalism isn't just of the biopolitics of the body of the architect, but it's also the depleting of human resources, which are capitalised upon because obviously cheaper labour in different countries means that you can get these buildings built. Now, this next part of the, and sort of last bit of the talk is about 24/7 architectural work. Because in order to do this amount of work across the number of disciplines, across the number of countries, it requires a kind of consideration of work ethic. And in architecture, work ethic is a fundamental part of the education as well, historically. So because Thatcher's children were born 26 years before she became Prime Minister, she was able to devote herself entirely to her political working life, and she practiced long work hours, minimal sleep culture that capitalism thrives upon to increase her own personal productivity. Those who work with her claim that she only slept 4 hours per night during weekdays, and that she suffered from a condition called sleeporexia. Very little sleep allowed her to put into practice her belief that disciplined long hours of hard work with little rest was the avenue to personal and economic independence, and this was the freedom that all Britons had the potential to pursue. Jonathan Crary notes that in relation to labour, a 24/7 work life renders plausible, even normal, the idea of working without pause, without limits. It's aligned with what is inanimate, inert and unageing. Clary claims that the features that distinguish living beings from machines are the need for pause or for rest. But 24/7 markets and a global infrastructure for continuous work and consumption undermine this, creating what Seedram and Fleming describe as the phenomenon of a dead man working. Globalised architectural practice, where a firm creates architecture 24/7 in multiple time zones, so their job is never stopped, is often not questioned in many practices. On the contrary, for many officers, it is seen as a sign of a successful, healthy business. But just as the bodies of construction workers are exploited, I argue that a neoliberal 24/7 work life in architecture is corporally detrimental to the well-being of its star designers. And here I include both Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid. And this is because of the acute imbalance of their lives. So when Koolhaas wrote the article Junk Space, he was actually basing it on all the hotels he was living in, the airports he was flying through. So in this instance with Koolhaas, his incessant travel, which was teaching at Harvard and many other countries and running projects all over the world, led to a near-death experience for him. He almost died of meningitis. And after that happened, from travelling to Lagos for a research project for Harvard, he decided he was going to start swimming. He was going to change his lifestyle. And whenever he moves anywhere, he has to be near a pool. He has to be able to go swimming in the morning beforehand. In Hadid's case, not having a partner, children or care commitments allowed her to devote her life entirely to her office work. And this led to Stuart Jeffries, in an interview with her in The Guardian, describing her as a workaholic and a single, destined to have only one-time companion, which he described as galloping influenza. And that was at the price of her global travel. Jeffries claims that at the time of his interview with flu-ridden Hadid in 2004, just after she'd won the Pritzker Prize, she hadn't stopped continuous travel for 12 years. It began at the age of 53 until she died at the age of 65. He writes, at that time when he interviewed her, she'd just got back from Vienna, where she teaches. She was jetting off again to oversee her projects. Some were in Rome, there was one in Leipzig, then she was off to Wolfsburg, then to Italy, where she was doing the Salerno ferry terminal. It was just under construction. Hadid claimed that her ill health over that 12 years was due to all the flying she did. She explained to Jeffries, I don't know what they put in the air on those planes, but it really is starting to affect my health. Now, continuous work without rest becomes a recurring theme in her interviews. In 2010, Haddestone interviews her again, and she states, he asks her this question, what did she do to relax? She replies, no, he says, she seemed to have, quote, not quite understood the question. She says, relax, nothing. With buildings going on in France, Britain, Milan and Azerbaijan, Spain and China, there is really no time to relax. Now, curiously, rather than a site of sanctuary or rest, Hadid's bedroom doubled as another place of work. She would sometimes lie awake in her white painted apartment, where she would, in her head, be going through the project. So she didn't describe herself as an insomniac, but she said she felt a commitment to be developing the projects all the time. So she explains, I lie awake thinking about buildings. I dream about buildings quite often, and I've even trained myself to work out the plan of a building in my head, not just on paper, on a computer screen. I think this limited and no-sleep kind of culture allowed Hadid to achieve this extraordinary productivity that she had over her life. I'm almost at the end, 2 slides. After suffering from and being treated for bronchitis at a Miami hospital at the age of 65, she died of a heart attack. 3 years earlier, aged 87, Thatcher had died at the Ritz Hotel in London of a stroke. Survived by her brother, Zaha Hadid, her other brother, had died just before her in London in 2012. She left her fortune then, which was worth just over 67 million pounds, was her personal wealth. She bequeathed it to him, £500,000 to Schumacher. She then gave the rest to her nephews and nieces. She set up the Zaha Hadid Foundation, and she also gave money to current and future employees and office holders of the company. Her architectural practice, for which she was the sole owner, was left in trust, and there have been disputes over it since. Now, the turnover for the office in 2015, at the time she died, was £48 million, and she had 372 people working for her. In the end of last year, the practice continues. It had made the most money it had ever made, £61 million in 1 year, and had increased to 520 people. So, this is the last slide. This is a photograph that I hunted down. This is Alvar Aalto and his wife were both architects. And this is his wife, Eino Aalto, with their 2 children. Okay. According to Aristotle, the ultimate purpose of human existence or life is the pursuit of eudaimonia. I never know if I say that correctly. Loosely translated as happiness. Aristotle argues that it's not about short-term pleasurable sensations, but is the possible outcome of the totality of one's life, how we participate in our whole life and play it out. There is no doubt that Hadid's total devotion to a work-centred life was her choice, and that she gained enormous satisfaction from her work, which I contend, interestingly, is not driven merely by materialist ambition. But here and in the book, I would argue that while Hadid's lifestyle, a lifestyle very typical of many architects and one promoted by the profession, it's not a sustainable model for future generations. The point of this lecture and my forthcoming book is to question the values of corporate practice operating on this long work hours culture, to re-evaluate the relationship between the architect's self and the cities that we live and design for others, exploring alternative modes of architectural education that can change work-life balance and architectural practice requires valuing rest and sleep and a balanced life in architecture with others outside work. Thank you very much.